I am an incredibly lucky person. I grew up in a stable home. I didn't have to worry about whether or not there would be food in the fridge or if my parents would be able to pay the bills. I grew up isolated from food insecurity, but I thought I understood what it was. Like many of us, then my first understandings of food insecurity came from interacting with food charities and food banks. My parents would bundle my siblings and I into the car, and we would go downtown to pack boxes at the food bank or serve meals at the soup kitchen. I remember looking around those spaces and recognizing that a lot of the folks who were accessing these services looked like me and my siblings. Most were not white. At school and at church, we would run food drives during the holidays, and we were told that this was how to ensure that folks who didn't have enough food got enough to eat. When it came to the issue of food insecurity, the solution was more food banks and more food drives and more soup kitchens. But this message is wrong. Although these services do provide important supports to families who need emergency food, they do not solve the long-term problem of food insecurity. Since then, I have learned that the roots of food insecurity are buried much deeper, and that we can't talk about food insecurity in Canada without also talking about poverty and racism. Food insecurity is defined as inadequate or insufficient access to food due to financial constraints. The thing that you need to remember about this definition is that the root of food insecurity is a lack of access to money. For folks who are food insecure, this can mean having to make some incredibly difficult choices, like choosing between the food, medicine, or household goods that they need for themselves and their families, and paying rent at the end of the month. This also means that if we can find a solution to food insecurity that puts enough money in people's pockets alongside a robust, universally accessible network of social programs, we'll be well on our way to finding a solution to food insecurity and a whole host of other social problems. Racism also impacts food insecurity in Canada. Food insecurity exists for the same reasons that poverty exists, and poverty does not impact everyone equally. They both trace their roots to systems of oppression that work together to determine who experiences the most food insecurity and who gets to be at the table in conversations about the solutions to food insecurity. Examining this problem and its solutions is part of what's called food justice work. And this is work that I'm involved in alongside an organization called FoodShare Toronto. It is difficult work that requires that we go a lot further in addressing food insecurity than opening up a few more food banks. It is work that seeks justice and food security for everyone. FoodShare Toronto runs community-led food access programming across the city of Toronto. These programs are designed to be universal so that anyone who needs to can access. But we also recognize that certain communities, like the Black and Indigenous community, for example, face greater barriers than others. For example, in our Good Food program, which sells affordable fruits and vegetables across the city, we have always noticed that there were a greater number of non-white folks accessing the program. Turns out it's not just because we have the best prices on okra and callaloo. We recognize that systemic racism is one of the factors that holds food insecurity in place. But we in the communities that we work alongside have often lacked the race-based data to reinforce these observations. To address this issue, in 2019, FoodShare partnered with the Proof Food Insecurity Research Team at the University of Toronto to engage in one of the first ever studies of Canada Community Health Survey data, looking specifically through the lens of race. The question that drove this study was, how do Black and white households differ in their risk of food insecurity? The results of the study matched what community leaders in the Black community had been saying for decades and already knew. When the study looked at food insecurity and compared between Black and white households in Canada, it found that 10% of white households are food insecure, compared with 28% of Black households. The study also found that Black households are 3.5 times more likely to be food insecure than white households. The study also looked at household composition and found that for white households, if you own your home or if you live in a two-parent household, then you are less likely to be food insecure than if you rent your home or live in a single-parent household. But if you are Black, the risk of food insecurity remains significantly higher, regardless of whether you rent or own your home and regardless of your household composition. These results suggest that the increased food insecurity found within the Black community in Canada is at least in part due to the additional barriers that these households face because they are Black. This demonstrates the impact of structural racism and anti-Black racism in Canada and how it makes it more difficult for Black folks to access wealth, leaving us at greater risk of food insecurity. Structural racism is a form of racism that is embedded as a normalized practice in a society or institution. And it's best understood through examples of how it works. Structural racism in the education system makes it less likely for non-white folks to graduate from high school or be accepted into post-secondary institutions. Structural racism in the hiring process makes it less likely for non-white folks to be hired to well-paying, stable positions. Structural racism in the financial sector makes it less likely for non-white folks to be approved for a loan if they need one. If somebody belongs to a community that is less likely to be able to succeed in the education system, is less likely to be able to access a well-paying, stable job, and is less likely to be approved for a loan when they need one, that person is almost certainly going to be at greater risk of food insecurity. That is what we are seeing in these statistics. So how does that impact how we think about the solutions to this problem? If we accept that food insecurity is linked to poverty and that poverty is linked to structural racism, then we must change how individuals, organizations, and institutions think about the solutions to this problem. If the problem is actually about money, then the solutions must also be about money and how to get more of it into the pockets of people who need it. The government likes to frame food charities and food banks as an effective way to respond to food insecurity. As somebody who works for a charitable food organization myself, I will be the first to tell you that we are never going to be able to solve this problem. We already struggle to access the resources that we need, and the scale and scope of problems like food insecurity are well beyond the ability of any organization to be able to solve. In fact, it is the government that bears responsibility to uphold this commitment. In 1976, the Canadian government signed on to what's called the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. This document contained a commitment by the government to create the conditions under which everyone in Canada could feed themselves and their communities with dignity today and into the future. But when we look around today, we can immediately see that the government has not upheld this commitment, especially in communities disproportionately impacted by food insecurity. In framing food banks and food charities as an effective solution to this problem, the government is running away from its commitment to uphold the right to food, and we should not accept this response. All of us in Canada, our friends, our parents, our neighbors, we all have the right to hold our elected officials responsible to this commitment. Anyone can pick up the phone and call their local representative to demand that they do more to address issues of food insecurity and to push other elected representatives to do the same. This sort of public advocacy work is so powerful because only the government has the power and the resources to do things like increase minimum wages or implement a universal pharmacare program or a universal basic housing guarantee, alongside perhaps a universal basic income. The sorts of systemic changes that will actually address problems like food insecurity. But what can organizations do to address this issue in addition to advocating to government? Well, for organizations to address the increased food insecurity that has been identified in the Black community and that almost certainly exists in other racialized communities as well, we must address structural racism. Structural racism leads to greater poverty in the Black community, which leads to greater food insecurity in the Black community. Therefore, any work that addresses and dismantles structural racism is also working towards increased food security for communities disproportionately impacted by these systems. As civil rights leaders have been saying for decades, one key solution to this challenge is to hire more Black people to stable, well-paid positions of decision-making power within organizations. These positions should not be contract or temporary, and they should include things like paid sick leave and health benefits. These sorts of positions are so powerful because they ensure a steady stream of long-term income into a household and provide the sort of long-term financial stability that low-paying or contract work simply cannot provide. These are the sorts of positions that actually protect households against food insecurity. But as a result of structural racism, these positions are currently less likely to go to Black people. For organizations to address this challenge, it's going to require many of them to undergo a substantial change in the way they operate. And I can give you a few examples of what this might look like. Organizations first can begin to collect and use race-based data to understand where within their staff and boards of directors diversity gaps may currently lie. Organizations can also do things like increasing wages, especially for their lowest paid positions, and establish wage ratios that limit the difference between the lowest paid and highest paid staff members in the organization. Organizations can also reduce reliance on paid credentials for their job openings, in recognition of the fact that many institutions discriminate in their recruitment process and the fact that many qualified applicants simply can't afford to access these credentials. Organizations can also work with grassroots community organization, working alongside communities that face disproportionate barriers to accessing the money they need for food, to ensure that calls for job applicants reach a wider diversity of candidates. Alongside all of this, organizations must continue to collect race-based data in order to gauge the impact of these interventions. All of these suggestions are designed to reduce the barriers for Black, Indigenous, and other racialized folks in navigating the hiring process. In doing food justice work, I have come to understand that the solutions to food insecurity have much less to do with food and much more to do with dismantling systems of oppression like structural racism. We must also remember that any solutions to food insecurity must be income-based and be implemented alongside a universal, joined-up network of robust social programs. Because with enough money in people's pockets and a social safety net that actually works for everyone, we'll be in a position to end food insecurity and poverty regardless of what community you come from. We must also remember that it is the government that bears the responsibility for making this happen, but that we as individuals have the power and the responsibility to hold our elected officials accountable to these commitments. Don't be afraid to call your local representative. You could do that right after watching this talk. If they start talking to you about food banks or meal programs, you can remind them that these are not the solutions that are going to eradicate this problem in the long term. Ultimately, the solutions are frustratingly simple. People need to be able to access the money they need for food. We must get our elected representatives to understand that the solutions to food insecurity must be income-based. We must also address the fact that minority communities, like the Black community, currently face greater barriers due to structural racism. We must get more Black, Indigenous, and other racialized folks into stable, well-paying positions of decision-making power within organizations. And we must all remember that we cannot talk about food insecurity without also talking about poverty and structural racism. If we can manage to do all of this, then perhaps we'll be in a position to imagine a future in which everyone in Canada can feed themselves, their families, and their communities with dignity, and where food insecurity is a distant memory. Thank you.